So, welcome to conducting personal interviews. So, personal interviews is a very um, valuable qualitative technique, and it's not only about asking the questions that matter, it's about developing a strategy so that when you are collecting your data through interviews and other means, of course, as well. But when you're collecting your data, you're ensuring that you are getting the information that you genuinely require from the interviews. We invest a lot of time into conducting an interview. And ultimately, we want to make sure that the data we obtain, i.e. the statements that our respondents make and so forth, we want to make sure that we have got or we are getting the best quality data that we can use. So for tonight, my objectives are as follows: to understand the principles of conducting interviews for research, to understand best practice roles and activities for the interviewer. And that's something many of us don't think about is, actually what type of relationship do I create with my respondent in order to ensure that I get the answers that will help me. But also, what type of relationship do I create that encourages and empowers and makes the respondent feel safe answering my questions? So that's a very important element. I do want to do a little bit of work on understanding how to design questions and how to design the discussion flow. And I call it for maximum usable output, to get as much information as you possibly can. One thing that we want to be able to achieve with interviews is not having to go back and do a follow-up. Imagine I do a 2-hour interview with you, and 2 hours is very long, but I don't get enough, and I phone you the next week and I say, I want to do another interview. Chances are you're going to say to me, no, I don't want to do this. It's too much. So we want to design the flow so that we get as much information as we can, so that we get continued buy-in from the respondent. But also, if something happens, we want to make sure that we've got the useful information in advance. And the final objective for tonight is to think through issues associated with conducting successful interviews. So how do you make sure the experience is a successful one? So I'm going to start off with the purpose of interviews in qualitative research. And, it's a method of gathering evidence, data, information. We know that. The terminology that's often used, or at least when I did my training, but the terminology that is used is the idea of it being rich, deep data. And that's what's important. And that's why we choose, for many of us, we prioritize being able to use interviews as a technique, because we get that very deep data, we get explanations, we get emotions, we get so many things from an interview that we cannot get if we use similar or same questions in a survey format. It's designed to give us deep data about the following things, and this is valuable for us because it's not just yes, no answers. We want to understand attributes. We want to understand people's behavior, why they behave a particular way, or why something happens a certain way, because not everything is going to be obvious. We want to understand preferences. We want to understand feelings or emotions from people, because that tells us more about their state of mind. It tells us more about their decision factors. It tells us more about the parameters or frameworks or paradigms in which they operate as individuals as well. It tells us about attitudes. And more importantly, not only does it tell us what the attitude is, if we're asking the right questions, we'll understand the rationale or the reason for these attitudes as well. It tells us opinions, and it also gives us knowledge or factual knowledge about certain things. So as a qualitative researcher, we're not only getting fact, 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 we're getting so many contributing factors or influences that are helping to structure people's actions and people's behaviors. And in addition to all of this, not only are we getting information that is vocal or verbal, we're also in many cases, but not every case, but we are in many cases getting body language. We're getting a visual understanding of the person as well. And that gives us an additional layer of data that we can use. And one of the things I think of is, body language and voice don't always match. For example, we can be talking about how absolutely excited we are about a particular topic, but the body language, like mine just then, the eyes are rolling, I'm looking like I'm bored, all sorts of things. The body language tells us something different. And our responsibility as a researcher is to, first of all, reconcile the difference between the words that are spoken as data, and secondly, the body language that is exhibited as data, and the fact that, there may be a mismatch between the two. And maybe as a researcher, our job is also to say, hey, you sounded so enthusiastic with your answer, but your body language tells me something else. Is there something else you'd like to share? Maybe they're not aware they're doing it, or maybe they're trying to hide their dissatisfaction with something, or some scenario like that, right? But it's still our responsibility as a researcher to try to bridge those gaps or try to reconcile what we see as a difference. So being a qualitative researcher using interviews, but also focus groups and many of the other techniques, it's not just about asking the right questions to fulfill your tick boxes of data you need or information you hope to achieve. It's also about understanding people and the subtleties of what people are sharing with us or how they are sharing it with us. So very important to think about that. So bottom of the slide, interviews help you to explain, better understand and explore research subjects, respondents or participants, opinions, behaviors, experiences, and phenomena. All right. There are a number of different types of interview channels. And this is kind of an old diagram, and we can tell it's old because Zoom doesn't exist yet in this diagram, and it uses the word telephonic, and I don't think any of us have used that word within the last 20 years. The purpose of this diagram is not to highlight that it's old, but the purpose is to highlight that an interview isn't always you and I face to face. Email interviews are a common technique. They have been used for a long time. If you're not able to get FaceTime with the respondent you want to communicate with, you can email questions and have them reply to it. The quality of the response, the level of detail, the level of nuance, the level of extra information, that layer of body language and all other things that tell us more, isn't as good, or it doesn't exist. But an email interview is still an interview, and we can still make use of the data. And I promise you, especially if you're dealing with, say, in a business context, very senior organizational members like CEOs or CFOs who don't have time for a face-to-face meeting, an email interview is acceptable. Maybe in healthcare, busy doctors, busy medical practitioners, maybe patients who find it, like I'm having trouble tonight with my speaking, maybe patients who find it very exhausting to talk but want to share. An email interview is actually valid and a great way for us to still get the data we want. COVID gave us the opportunity to pivot qualitative methods through the use of online channels. So for example, using, our phone, using WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram or Facebook Messenger or whatever else, actually opened up the realm of opportunities for getting getting interview information. Now, before COVID happened, the idea of doing an interview over WhatsApp video or WhatsApp asynchronous voice messages, for example, was not very well received. And it's only because of the need to pivot during COVID that businesses first, and then academics and academic institutions like universities as second, said, you know what? These tools are really great because they still enable you to get your research, to enable you to do your interviews. And what WhatsApp or Zoom does, just like we experienced tonight in this particular situation, is it enables a wider geography. Whereas previously, if I was mostly focusing on personal interviews that were face to face, my geography or my area that I can cover is limited. Zoom means I can go almost anywhere, everywhere in the world. Now, you might say, well, you can use the telephone, and that was popular, but the telephone costs money. Zoom does not. So all I want to get across with this is, look, there are multiple channels that we can embrace to get interviews. Don't look at it and think one is a challenge and ignore the others. And also recognize the fact that maybe if you're interviewing 20 people for your research, Some will be face-to-face, some will be Zoom, some will be email. Even if the questions are the same, the channel, the format, the approach might be a little bit different. And the important message is that's okay. But when you write up in chapter 3, you need to highlight the fact that different respondents interacted with you through different channels. Now I want to get straight into the different types of interviews, and this is the format of the interview more than anything else. So I want to start off with the idea of structured or very standardized interviews. And I'm going to say these are easy if you have a big number of respondents. These are the easiest if you are a new researcher. And these are the easiest if you are not expecting detailed or nuanced responses. More common sense answers or more typical standard answers, a structured interview is fine. And basically, a structured interview is a predetermined set of questions, but precise questions. What is your name? What is your age? What is your political affiliation? What do you think about topic X? How does this differ to topic Y? Very structured questions that each person you are engaging with is actually answering the same question. The advantages are easy. Okay, it's extremely rigid, but the rigidity means you get a lot of data that is easy to compare. That's valuable, especially if we're new to research. It makes our life easier. Let's just say that. It's very easy to code and to analyze. Now, when we have a very structured interview, our coding approach almost is like coding a survey, more so than coding a discussion, because the questions are so structured. The coding categories that we tend to develop from the experience are a lot more standardized. This is great for a large sample because every interview is pretty much the same. And you're simply going question 1, question 2, question 3, getting it out there. It makes it faster for you. It's easy to replicate and compare. So I can come along as an independent researcher using your questions, finding an appropriate population and a sample within that, and I can replicate your research. I may still get different answers or different findings, but that's part of the game. But I'll certainly be able to conduct the research the same way that you did. It generates reliable results because you're asking exactly the same thing to every person. So you're not changing your wording of your questions. You're not going off track or probing certain respondents in different ways for information than you're probing someone else. So you're sort of getting a very, I want to say generic, but you're getting a very standard approach. And they're usually quick to execute because you have exact questions. It tends to be much faster for you as the researcher because you're not going off that track. You're not saying, oh, this is interesting. Let me ask you more. You'll simply just say, okay, answer done. Next question, and you're going through. The cons or the dissatisfactions, the challenges, the problems with structured is there is a limited scope for deep assessment. You're not getting the best quality response or interaction or narrative that you could be getting. You're putting everything into a box. You're letting your respondents respond in that same box, and that's it. So it's not quite, it's not deep enough. It's not giving you the maximum benefit you can get. And I'll say this, if I have a choice of interviewing 100 people with a simple, structured interview versus the choice of interviewing 10 people in a much less structured manner, I will interview the 10 because I'm going to get much deeper, much more personalized responses from that. Another disadvantage is the accuracy of information overpowers the detail of the information. Yes, we get answers, but we're not necessarily getting the opportunity to fully flesh out or have those answers developed for us in a way that can be meaningful. So researcher can't probe interesting findings. If I'm asking you questions and you're responding to me with something interesting, a structured interview protocol means I can't ask you more information about that. So I lose that opportunity. There's an argument that significant time is required for structured interviews. And I think it's still the point that you have, a pattern that you have to follow. I'm going to personally say, you know what? Every interview takes time. If I'm going to interview one person, I'm spending somewhere between 60 to 90 minutes in an interview. I'm spending 2 to 3 times that amount of time preparing for the interview, and probably an equal amount of time dealing with the interview afterwards, transcribing it, coding it, maybe even a lot more than 3 to 4 times. So there is a lot of time involved in it. Now we can move into I like to think a more qualitative, but I want to say a more quality-oriented interview style. And that's semi-structured. And semi-structured interviews to me is a guided conversation. And that's better. It's not just question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. Semi-structured interviews have a framework. We have a series of topics, themes, broad questions that we have to answer, but we also allow ourselves to go deeper. We allow ourselves to go off topic should the respondent have something interesting to say. So in this way, I call it a guided conversation because it is a genuine conversation, but there is a set of focal points for it. The advantages are still you prepare your questions in advance. It's easy prep for you, but your research guidelines retain some flexibility. And what I mean by that is, look, I know I've got 6 questions that 6 questions I must ask, but I have a little bit of flexibility in my choice of words. Say, for example, I'm interviewing everybody in this session tonight. We're from different countries. We have different levels of competency in English. And I might ask each of you the same question, but I may choose to use different words for some of you to make it easier, just to make sure that you fully understand my question and can, of course, then give me the best quality answer you are capable of. So that's the flexibility. It gives us that choice to ask questions in, as I say here, a format they prefer, but that simply becomes our choice of word use. It also becomes our questioning approach. How do I ask a certain question in a certain way? Or maybe I've got a challenging question. How do I build up the relationship between yourself and myself in order to ask you a hard question? In a structured interview, I have 10 questions for you. In a semi-structured interview, I can adjust the questions. I can massage or manipulate the questions in a way. But I can also develop a relationship, a sense of trust between yourself and myself through that journey as well. It gives a flexible structure at the interview, so I get to respond accordingly. As you give me answers, I get to adjust how I want to ask things. But it also means I don't have to ask question 1 first, always. I might feel more comfortable with you asking question 4 first, for example. So it enables that. The disadvantages are a little bit, participants may question reliability factor. Now, probably not our participants, probably our Viva examiners are more likely to question this. And as a researcher, we have to be able to say, or we have to be able to justify this. At the end of the day, the justification is always in the data obtained and the depth of data that has been, obtained. It's not difficult to justify. The challenge, though, with semi-structured for us as a researcher, the challenge is comparing two answers becomes sometimes difficult because no two questions have the same structure in the way that they're asked. The result means we can't 100% compare the responses perfectly like we would with, say, a structured interview or a survey. But again, we as qualitative researchers, what we're trying to do is tell stories. We're giving voice to other people. So semi-structured allows us to do this. And the final version is the idea of an unstructured interview. And this is kind of very or very conversational. So it's an in-depth interview. It is conversations with a purpose, and that's more so than a guided conversation. This has a real purpose. We have the least number of questions. It's very free flow. It's based upon certain themes that you want to touch upon, but nothing more. The purpose with a fully unstructured interview is to build a rapport or a relationship or a bond with our respondents. And the goal, the end goal of that is we want them to trust us because we want them to tell us more and more things about our questions. Now, the challenge here, we do need a very skilled researcher or interviewer to make sure that parameters are not exceeded. The parameters are not so much the questions per se, but the interpersonal communication style with the respondents and getting that the way, the way that we want. The advantage is actually developing rapport and relying on that is remarkably easy. It's not a difficult thing. It gives participants an opportunity to better explain answers, the gray areas. And the most valuable part of this is it's the flexibility to explore and to detract. Maybe I'm asking you questions and I can sense that you are feeling uncomfortable about the questions that I'm asking you. In a structured interview approach, I can't take back a question. In an unstructured interview, I can say, look, yeah, I know that that's actually quite a personal question. Let's move on from that, see how we feel a little bit later, come back to it. And if we don't, it's fine. And that just gives me that opportunity to read the room, as they say, to understand the respondent that I'm interviewing and to be able to respond to their body language, to be able to respond to their levels of comfort and so forth. The difficulties, the challenges, duration and time. Unstructured interviews are much longer. If a structured interview is planned for 30 minutes, an unstructured interview will probably take 2 hours. It is a deeper tool, a deeper approach to research. Again, reliability is questionable as you can't necessarily compare the answers to others. But if we are interviewing people, we're not trying to get percentages. We're not trying to get a quantification of their stories. So we are still able to share their voice. We're still able to share their narrative in our writing. And I think it actually makes for a more interesting chapter 4 and chapter 5, because what we are able to achieve with this is different people's stories contributing to our story. Much like a literature review, we don't cite the same researcher or the same author in every single paragraph. We build a story. And each person tells us something different. And we pick and choose how those different pieces make the story that we're writing. So although it's seen as a challenge or a difficulty, I actually also see it as a very strong bonus. The only real challenge is that ethics issues can be considered problematic here, because it is to do with, in part, I guess, identification of the individual. It is to do in part with their freedom and willingness to give responses and so forth. But I'm also going to say, although it's listed as a challenge or listed as a con in my terms on the slide, it's also extremely easy to defend. And we have to get into the practice of, as we choose or as we make decisions as a researcher, we have to get into the practice of being able to defend ethical shortcuts or ethical concerns or considerations that may be raised. And I do believe with an unstructured interview, it's not difficult to defend from an ethical perspective. It's our responsibility as the researcher to, as we go into our viva, or as we're writing up the section in chapter 3 on ethics, is to actually explain the rationale of our decisions. The interview is ultimately an interpersonal encounter. It doesn't matter whether you're doing structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. It's still an interpersonal encounter. And as a result, it needs a few good quality communication skills. So we need social skills. Some of us make horrible interviewers. Some of us don't have the personality. We might be nervous, we might be grumpy, we might be difficult, we may hate people. I'm surprisingly, I'm that type of person, but I can turn on the charm and do a decent interview, sure. We need to make sure that as an interviewer, we are able to demonstrate empathy. We are able to demonstrate warmth, attentiveness. We need to have the ability or the comfort to use humor where it's appropriate. And consideration, just understanding other people, actually become fantastic skills for good interviewing. Now, I'm going to say this on the record. Not all of us are built to interview others. Not all of us are great at interpersonal communication. Honestly, if you met me 30 years ago when I was starting my career, this was not for me. You know, it took a long time to develop the skills. We just have to have a willingness to try. But what I want to say is, look, if you feel that your personality is not going to be beneficial to the interview process, you are able to get a research assistant to conduct interviews for you. At the end of the day, what you as a researcher require is the data that comes from this. It doesn't require you to be the one asking the questions. And likewise, say, for example, I have 60 interviews to do. Maybe you have 1 or 2 people helping you and you're splitting that workload. That's okay as well, as long as you're using the same playbook. So if you say, hey, Craig, I can't do interviews, I'm horrible. Can you interview 10 people for me? And you'll pay me, of course, because, you know, nobody does this for free. But let's assume you say that. Your responsibility as the researchers say, this is the interview protocol. This is the interview guidelines. This is the parameters. And it's my responsibility to follow that. If you say to me, hey, Craig, I've got 100 interviews to do. Can you do 50 and I do 50? Sure. Again, same interview protocols that we have. It exists. We know that we're going to approach it in a similar way, which means our data, our responses are the same. And then you, as the researcher, get to do the transcriptions and the coding and all of that, which is perfectly fine. It's an acceptable way. So don't go into the interview process believing that you have to do 100% of the work. It's not the case. Okay, some other interpersonal skills to think about. Judgmental attitudes, shock, discomfort will be immediately detected from both sides. So if I ask you a question and you give me a disturbing answer, I go, oh, I've already damaged the interview process. So your own body language must be well regulated. It must also be tempered in a way that you're always showing empathy, warmth, attentiveness, and so forth. But you've also got to work very hard at not responding negatively to a question, sorry, not responding negatively to an answer, sorry, or to any information that somebody has shown. So be very cautious about that. This is where the planning comes into fruition, because having a conversation with anyone can at any time go crazy. We all know that. We have friends who surprise us. We have family who surprise us. We have lecturers who surprise us. We've got to be very conscious of reminding ourselves not to react to something, preparing ourselves for the possible answers that might come up from that. Never answer a question for the respondent. And what I mean by that is, look, our job is to ask questions. Our job is not to suggest answers or to try and answer it for them. If they can't answer the question, we have a few options. We can move on. We can reword or rephrase the question. We can use external resources to help us. We might even do a follow-up via email, but we should never give an answer and say, would that be an answer you would say? Because that is wrong. We have to make sure we're completely engaged with them. We're keeping track of the questions. We have to use active listening. This is why, like, for me, I'm not very good at active listening. It's sort of a technique I'm just personally, I don't find it comfortable or enjoyable, but I've got better at it over time. Active listening is about really showcasing you understand what they said. So it's techniques like repeating back an answer that they've said. Or my second example, which I really hate, but it works. Wow, tell me more about that, please. As you can see, I probably look incredibly fake when I do that because I feel fake on that. But it's showing interest, it's probing, it's acknowledging that you understand what the person has said. And then, something a bit more simple. Oh, that's really interesting. That also sounds fake in my voice. Again, this comes down to our personal social skills, the empathy, the warmth, the character that we demonstrate. Don't be afraid of silence. Sometimes people need a moment to think. That's okay. If they're silent, you can probe or prod the respondent to reflect, or you can do things like, would you like to take a few minutes break for a drink? And then we'll come back to it. Give your respondent time. Whether this is face to face or whether we're doing a Zoom interview, doesn't matter. If there's silence, it's a chance to think, it's a chance for you to say, even to say, is that question a little bit uncomfortable at this stage? Would you like me to move on to another question and then come back to it? I'm going to argue don't follow the interview guide. Now, what I mean by that is in a structured interview, it's question 1 through to 10, right? We always must do it the same way. My practical advice from over 30 years experience in doing qualitative research, follow the respondent. Read the body language, listen to their answers, see what they want to see what they're missing out. Don't be so rigid as to where you are. Let them take the conversation the way they want, and then you sort of manage that process. You navigate that. If they're using or if they're bringing up some new information, follow that up within reason, but don't lose track of what the direction of the interview is. So give them a few minutes to talk and then say, okay, that was a really interesting segue or a really interesting diversion from the main theme. What I'd like to do now is to move back to the core theme of today's interview. And the most important thing is try not to think about time. So relax into your interview. There's two parts to this, okay? As a researcher, we have got to be very conscious of our time in the sense that we need to know what is a reasonable period for an interview. If you think an interview is going to be 30 minutes, allocate an hour because it won't happen in 30 minutes. Communicate the fact that you think this will be a 1-hour interview, but don't sit there in the interview with watching your watch or checking your phone to see what time it is or anything like that. Don't do that. Just let it happen. If your interviewee says, hey, Craig, I'm running out of time, that's at which you say, okay, no worries, let's focus on the last few most important things, and you prioritize. But don't make it feel like it has to be a certain way. There are cultural elements to this too. And I do quite a bit of work, a bit of consulting, and presentations as well in Europe. And I'm not sure if there's anybody in the room tonight who is from Europe, so I apologize in advance. But European people are very precise. If they set a 1-hour interview, at the end of 60 minutes, I'm sorry, we have to go, goodbye. And they're on to the next thing. If you're in Asia, an hour stretches into 2, it stretches into 3. Time has a different sense of dimension. So be realistic, make sure you communicate that as well as you possibly can. And don't let time stress you out unless you know that your interviewee or your respondent has a very tight window. So here's the thing. If I'm interviewing senior people within an organization, or if I'm interviewing government officials, I'm a lot more conscious on my time, but it's not the time per se that I am conscious about. What I'm conscious about is focusing on the questions that will give me the information I must have. The rest, if they allocate more time for me, great. If they don't, I want to achieve a certain number of questions or a certain set of themes or topics. And I want to be able to leave that interview having obtained all that. If I'm looking at other individuals, more community-based, of course, my thoughts on time are broader, but it is always my responsibility to communicate time expectations with them first. There are some basic ethics with interviewing. So informed consent, we should all know this, but I'll touch on a couple. The right of withdrawal. This is the stressful one. Everyone has the right to withdraw from the interview process. The hassle, the inconvenience of this is if halfway through an interview somebody says, I don't want to continue, it's a waste of time for us. So we may even lose the opportunity to use the data we got from them to that point. And that's why building rapport is important, strategizing how to ask the questions and so forth. That's so important for us because of that. Of course, we want to keep confidentiality. That's subject to the type of research we're doing. I know somebody who did some research in Malaysia, and his area of interest is incredibly niche. He interviewed, I think, 14 people, CEOs of particular companies. He went through the process, as far as I know, relating to anonymity of confidentiality, not identifying a person. But having interviewed 14 people out of an industry that has something like 15 people in it, it's pretty easy to figure out who your respondents are and things like that. So, this is very contextual, and you've got to be cognizant of, whether that can happen. And that comes down to not only confidentiality, it comes down to the identification as well. Because identifying people talking about certain things that they're happy to talk to you about, sometimes you just can't hide who they are. You have to think about the storage of transcripts. This is often a university requirement. So when I started my career and we were doing interviews, all transcripts and recordings had to be kept in our university office for 7 years. So, there's a lot of crap in my office at periods of time because we were mandated to keep them. As a PhD candidate, probably your supervisor is mandated to keep them, but they might have to be available. So check with your university what the requirements are. The main ethics becomes further use of transcripts and information obtained, and this relates back to informed consent. And this brings us to a different issue. This brings us to the issue of our personal publication strategy. When we prepare for our PhD dissertation, often we have in mind, I'm going to do the interview purely for the PhD so I can get that done. And when you do informed consent, chances are you've written for use within your PhD dissertation. Great. But what if you want to publish that as journal, or you want to publish it as book chapter or something else? You might not have informed consent to use those transcripts. So when you're thinking about interviews, when you're writing the informed consent statement, make sure it includes PhD dissertation and possible journal articles, because you've got to make sure that your respondents are giving you permission for the multiple areas that their content may come into play. Now, usually we learn this pretty fast, but most times as a PhD candidate, when we're, really new to research, we forget about that. So just keep that in mind, that your informed consent statement allows you to use the information within the transcripts for more than just your dissertation. We have to think about access to research outputs. So as I'm producing my research, am I giving each individual respondent a copy of my dissertation, or am I giving them something else? Many, many years ago, in fact, the woman who got me into university teaching in yikes, 1993, no, 1992, sorry. The woman who got me into university teaching was actually a research candidate and staff member at the university. And she was doing research, and I was one of her respondents. And she did two things that I liked. As soon as transcripts were available from our interview, she would send me a copy, or there wasn't email quite so much back that day. She would print me a copy and post it to my house. But she'd give me a copy of the transcripts so that I could go through and correct anything, so that I could go through and add anything. Or if I subsequently saw something that I wish I had not have said, I could cross it out, let her know, and say, hey, these are the changes. So that's access to output. Well, it's actually access to throughput in that context, because I got the transcripts to verify. The second one is I got a copy of her dissertation when it was published. Now, back then, the idea of infographics was not a big thing. So giving somebody a thesis was almost a normal practice. But you might like to say, look, you've contributed here. I'm happy to give you a 2-page summary infographic of the research findings, or I'm happy to give you the whole dissertation if you want. That's up to you to decide, but you've got to decide what are you offering your individual respondent. And the final one on this list is emotional support options, both during and after the interview. Maybe it's a challenging interview. Maybe if you're touching upon sensitive issues, for example, maybe they may need a counselor or access to a counselor. So always, I'm not saying you're paying for it, because I don't believe that should ever be the case. But what I'm saying is you need to, if you feel that your topic could touch upon emotional or challenging issues, or issues of concern for the individual, or it could impact their mental health in any way, or if it could put them under pressure, make sure that you provide options, or lists of options where they can get additional support to help them with this. Okay, so types of topics and questions, and we kind of went through this before. Behaviors, opinions, values, feelings, knowledge, sensory, emotions, background, demographics. There's different types of content that we might get. I'm not doing the activity. I kind of want to move forward. Let's have a look at best practice guideline or ideas to developing questions. And there's a couple of slides on this. The best questions to ask are the ones that get the longest answers from the respondent. Whatever you do, do not ask questions that can be answered with one word. If your question lends itself to a yes or no answer, you are doing a survey. You are not doing an interview. but you're also getting really crap information, which isn't going to help you. So focus very strongly on making sure that the person can ask, making sure that the person can answer using more than one word. And I'll give you a really simple example, and this is a marketing example. So, I apologize because marketing's not always the most fun thing. But when we teach customer service, there's always this difference between can I help you as a shopkeeper or service staff in a shop retail outlet? Can I help you? The answer is always yes or no. When you change that question to how can I help you, you can't answer with a yes or no. Your answer has to be longer. So just changing the phrasing of of your questions, the choices of words that you use within that context actually helps you force people to use longer answers. Don't ask questions that require your respondents to do your analysis for you. This is your job. Sometimes we might ask, why do you think this? Or can you detail it more? We're getting them to tell us their experience or their understanding. We're not getting them to tell us what they believe is the cause of something. That's where you put together everybody's contribution and come up with that answer. Don't ask for hearsay or opinions on behalf of a group that they are part of. For example, what do people around here think of X? You're asking for the individual's lived experience. You're asking for the individual's own lived experience as to your scenario. You're not asking them, what do you think about something else? So do you think that South Africans in general do not want to have Elon Musk return to the country? Yeah, go survey 100,000 South Africans on that, because asking one person their opinion of what they think other people think is crazy. What you can do is, as a South African, do you want Elon Musk to return to the country? That's valid, but that's about them. It's not about others for which they have no responsibility or obligation to speak on behalf. Never be afraid to ask embarrassing questions. If you don't ask, they won't tell. The trick with embarrassing questions is about approaching it in a way that you're not going to make the person feel uncomfortable. Adjust the language of your interview according to respondent. Now, that doesn't mean I switch from English to Russian to German to Japanese. What it means is the level of my language. If I'm interviewing a child, I'm not going to be using formal words. I'm not going to be using big words. I'm not going to be using complicated terminology. I'm going to be talking to a kid as a kid. If I'm talking to a business CEO, I'm going to be in a much more professional tone than if I'm talking to somebody out in the community about community issues. So it's about understanding the communication patterns of the individuals and their social setting, and then communicating to them in a way that they recognize. Take care to word questions so respondents are motivated to answer as completely and honestly as possible. The wording's hard. It takes practice. I'm always going to advise, if you're going to do an interview, whether you're doing it formally or not, do a pilot. Okay, run a pilot test. Just interview a couple of people to see how they feel about your questions, whether they are giving you the type of information you want. It does not have to be a formal pilot test. It can be very informal, just to give you the feedback and to give you the confidence to proceed in that respect. Ask how questions rather than why questions, because you want to get stories of process rather than acceptable accounts of behavior. You know, we're not asking somebody to justify something, we're asking somebody to explain something. So, you know, how did you come to join this group is going to get you a very different answer to why did you join this group, or why did you join this webinar? The how did you come to join this? Oh, I was struggling with my interview protocols, and I realized there were people out there who could give some credible quality advice. I saw the advertisement and decided that this was going to help me develop professionally. If I say, why did you join this webinar? All you're going to do is say, because I wanted to learn something. The two answers are significantly different from each other. And of course, the how, or the answer to the how question, was much more detailed. Think about the logical flow. So what topics need to come first? What topics or what questions follow naturally? Now, this is going to take adjustment after several interviews. You know, you'll do a few interviews and you'll realize the way you think you want to ask the questions isn't quite giving you what you genuinely want. So it's going to evolve a little bit over time. And again, this is why a simple pilot with 2 or 3 people whose data you're not using, okay? You're just using it to train yourself in the process and the structure. It's going to help you a lot here. Some people say difficult or embarrassing questions should be asked towards the end of the interview, which is when rapport has been established. I kind of agree with that. You know, you've got to build up that trust before you can ask difficult questions. But sometimes it's not always possible. If you're dealing with sensitive topics, make sure you speak to your respondent before you even start the interview. Give them a heads up. Make sure they're comfortable with that. Put that into the informed consent statement so that they're aware of it when they're making their decision to contribute to your research. Most important advice, the last question should always provide some closure for the interview. So you want to leave the respondent feeling empowered, listened to, happy that they talked to you. An easy way to do this is a final question can be, look, you know, we've talked about a range of issues relating to X this afternoon. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, or anything you feel that would be a valuable contribution that I haven't touched upon? And that as a final question is really giving your respondent the last word from the experience. Now we come to sequence of questions. So get people involved in the interview as soon as possible. That means don't spend half an hour talking to them about what's happening and then only then ask the first question. You know, have a chat over the phone first, telling them what to expect. And then when you meet up or you schedule the actual interview, it's like, oh, great to see you again. Thanks for coming. Want to talk about what's your experience with this, and get straight into it. Before asking about some controversial things, such as feelings or conclusions about items, first ask about some facts. So sort of set the factual track in motion before you're asking for opinions. But also intersperse fact-based questions throughout the interview. It's sort of termed overkill and anchor, but what you're doing is every so often you're bringing the interview back to factual reality versus opinions. So you're reminding people that, you know, it's grounded in a global experience as much as an individual experience. Always ask questions about the present before you ask about the past or the future. So you want to understand how they feel now before you want to understand whether that's changed from prior or it's going to change into the future. As I said, the last question, allow the respondent to provide other information or give their impression of the interview. You might say, look, you know, I've asked a lot of questions. If there's anything you think you want to say, great. If not, how do you feel the interview this evening went? Is there anything you wish would have been done differently? Again, what you want to do is make the person feel listened to in their experience. Okay, so some kinds of questions. Sorry, just give me a minute to have a drink. This slide in many, many ways is a quite self-explanatory, I guess, more than anything else. So I'm not going to spend too long on it. But you know, we've got introducing questions, we've got follow-up questions, we've got probing questions, we've got specifying questions, direct questions, indirect, structuring, silence, and interpreting questions. All of these are there, and I'm going to put these up on LinkedIn tonight as well for you guys in the chat group. But all of these are different types of questions designed to get you to think. Sometimes we can write these in advance, sometimes we just have to go with the flow, but recognize that there are different types of questions. So for example, a structuring question enables us to stop one theme and move on to a different theme. But a probing question is one that allows us to say, you know, you've just spoken about this. How did you feel when this happened? You know, you're asking for more detail and you're being quite specific with that. There is the idea of vignette questions as well. And I've just realized I've lost part of the information from my slide. So not sure what happened to the graphic there. I'll share that a little bit later, but sometimes what you do is a vignette is like a very tiny case study. So you put up, you give them a few quotes on a handout, or you tell a little story, and then you ask 2 or 3 questions related to that, about their reaction, their interpretation of it. What I'm trying to get into with this, and within the next few slides before we wrap up for this evening, is an interview is not only question and answer. Sometimes you have to provide something external for them in order to be able to get the answers that you want. Sometimes the case study, the vignette approach, takes the discussion away from the individual, but it still gives the individual's response to the situation that you have at hand. Oh, and there it is. Okay, that was how I set up how I set up my PowerPoint. So the example is a woman moves here from another country and is seeking a new physician. She learns about a local doctor who's from the same country and the same religion. She calls his office to become. She speaks with a member of staff, blah, blah, blah. Here's some questions. Is it ethical for the doctor to refuse? Would it be acceptable to refuse to see the patient because of gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, insurance type, blah, 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 blah. Lots of different things, right? But what you're doing is you're giving a small case study, and then you're asking a behavioral-based questions or interpretive questions. This is good when you know people have opinions, but you are also aware that they may not want to share personal lived experience stories. So it helps helps provide a different option for them. How do I obtain adequate response? And this is just called the probe. So, you know, if somebody's not answering you in detail enough, we kind of have to ask away. And there's a few different ways. So, you know, the silent probe is I just sit in silence until you finish answering my question. You know, what do you think of this webinar so far tonight? Nobody answers, everybody's silent. And it's like a teacher at primary school who remains quiet until someone in the class answers the question. You've got to be a pretty confident researcher to do that. Overt encouragement. Oh, I'm certain you've got an example from this. You must be. Have a think. Just take that moment and think, and you should be able to do it. And that's really just sort of pushing the person a little bit. Elaboration. It's just explaining your question in more detail because maybe they didn't get it, or maybe you re-explaining the question in a bit more detail gives them more time to think about the response that they want. Are we going to ask for clarification? So, you know, would you like me to explain the question differently? Is there, sorry, excuse me. Is there an example perhaps that I can give you? Or do you need information? Or is there anything that I've said that didn't make sense? Asking for clarification from my respondents makes me look like a pathetic researcher sometimes. It makes it look like I haven't done a good job. But this is also the challenge associated with language or levels of competency in language, which is again why it is such a need for us to use the level of language of our respondents. The last one is repetition, simply repeating the question, not very helpful. Now, back into I guess, the thematic of the vignette is, look, there are many other ways to encourage a question, or to encourage, sorry, the answer to a question. So a vignette gives us a case study. Image prompts are when we show a photograph and we ask people questions about what they think is happening within the situation. And we have two classroom-based image prompts here. And I might ask you a question, what do you think is happening in each situation? Do you think the student is feeling comfortable? Do you think the student is feeling threatened? Do you feel the environment is casual or formal? Do you feel that this child is enjoying the education that they are experiencing? So many questions I can ask you based on the image. And it's simply a discussion point. Now, you know, we can go, I can ask you those questions and I can move on from there and say, thinking back to your own primary school experience or thinking back to your own secondary school experience, Can you relate to either of those pictures? Could you share a situation that happened when you felt either similar to the picture on the left or similar to the picture on the right? So it's a way of getting into a topic and then moving on for the respondent to be able to tell us more. Some more practical advice. I've just realized my, oh yeah, that's right. Um, some more practical advice. Never finish sentences for people. Always try to remain neutral. So don't go back here and say, I think the teacher on the left, I think the female teacher is overly friendly in a classroom, and that's not conducive to good education. Or I think the male teacher is, um, yeah, reacting in a way that may or may not be appropriate. I don't want to, I don't want to give my opinion on a question. I don't want to give my opinion on a vignette or a photographic prompt. Um, I want to stay as neutral as possible, because if I have a particular uh, bias, if I have a particular bias towards something, your answers are automatically going to be biased, because you're going to try and address the question the way you think I want it. So that's not good. Be careful about your own appearance when note taking. Many of us take notes during an interview. I personally like to have a recorder. I record the full interview, but I will take notes. My notes are usually not on what the person is saying. My notes are usually about body language, or if maybe we've sort of come to something interesting, I'm looking at the timer on my recording device, and I'm noting down, the 27 minutes and 15 seconds. Look at this. So I'm just writing down 27:15. But don't make the note taking look like it is an area of concern. Don't make the note taking look like you're judging or evaluating. So the note taking should be very casual. Let's have a nice, simple notebook, a pen, have it there for the whole process. Let the person know, you take a few notes. This is to help you remember times that you want to come back to, or to think about future questions and stuff like that. So, sort of downplay it as much as possible. And the one thing to always consciously avoid is never lose control of the interview. Sometimes we'll get the misfortune of interviewing somebody with a very dominant personality, and they will try to take the interview in crazy ways. My advice in this is, look, if the respondent is trying to control too much about the interview, what you should be doing is wrapping it up a lot faster. It's safer for you to, in your own mind, say, this is not going to help me. This is not going to give me data that I am comfortable with. So in respect of that, maybe you don't answer all the questions. Maybe you don't probe too much. Ask a few questions, let a little bit of time elapse and say, that was a really strong interview. Thank you so much for your time. Here's your Starbucks voucher. Have a good day. And just put it down to experience. We might do an interview that we felt was intimidating towards us, or threatening towards us, or uncomfortable. And it's okay to say, out of the 12 interviews we did, 10 of the interviews are being used for this research. 2 of the interviews were unsuitable because of the behavior of the respondent. And again, good quality research write-up is you being transparent about that. In the methods chapter, challenges faced, 2 interview respondents were aggressive and made me feel uncomfortable. I chose not to include their interviews in this research as I chose to wrap up the interview early. What I care about is the transparency, the honesty from you as a researcher. I might ask you about what they said, or I might ask you in Eviva what the scenario was. But because you were transparent, I'm never going to challenge you and say, well, you should have used it. I appreciate the decisions that you made as a researcher. Now, just before we sort of wrap up, I want to talk about immediately after an interview, and there's a few different phases, okay? Before an interview, I'm always preparing my questions, etc. During the interview, I'm taking notes. But straight after the interview, once the person's gone or once you're gone, sit down somewhere, check that your recording was fine, check that nothing went missing, make sure you can store it safely. But make any notes on your written notes. There might be other things you want. Now is the time to note down anything extra. So you should be spending maybe 10 to 15 minutes adding notes. So it might be things that they said that you want to revisit. It may be comments or thoughts or reflections on body language or tone of voice. Maybe any number of things. It can be observations you made. Maybe you noticed that the person had very impatient body language during the interview or seemed uncomfortable or things like that. It's just additional notes that give you context later on when you're doing your transcripts. So you've got the transcripts there, and then you come back to observational notes that also triangulate with the transcripts that you've got. Now, talking about should I record and should I transcribe? I've got this horrible old slide here now, and I recognize this is a very old slide for me because my thinking changes quite regularly about this. Yes, you should record. Absolutely, you should transcribe. I'm never going to say there's a situation you shouldn't, but it's different. Let's just go through a few of these points. Recording and transcribing helps to correct the natural limitations of our memories. If we're not recording it, we're not getting verbatim quotes. We're not getting every piece of information. We're not getting something we can listen to over and over again to get more information. We get very superficial approach. It really does allow a much more thorough examination and repeated exposure to the interviewee's answers. It's great that others who are permitted to access your transcripts, for example, can also make use of your research. It helps to counter accusations that your analysis could be influenced by your own personal bias or values, because the transcript is a matter of fact what was said versus what you recall was said. But it also means that you can use the data in other ways. So, for example, a couple of years down the track, theories may have been evolved or developed, which explain your research in a different way, but you can revisit that with your transcripts, your previous interviews, and actually progress from there. The disadvantage is knowing that I'm being recorded as an interviewee. It introduces a different dynamic into what we call the social encounter of the interview. So it can scare people. It may limit people in terms of initially the types of answers that they want to offer and how they want to respond to things. But more frustratingly is transcribing is a time-consuming process. And that's the thing, you need good equipment and then you need transcription options. So let's do a couple of scenarios. Transcription can be done using AI, which will give you about an 85 to 95% accuracy rate. A transcription has to be 100%. So AI will do a first round. You will then have to go through and do a second and probably a third round just to make sure it's 100% correct. If you're not such an AI person, or worse still, if you're very old school like me, you'll do the transcription by hand. It's not unreasonable that a 1 hour interview takes up to 8 hours to accurately transcribe to 100%. There's a lot of time that goes into it. So I do really encourage AI. Use something like Otter.ai. It's one that I've used before. Even Google Documents has a transcription. You just play the recording and it will do it. It's about 75% accurate. So, you're coming back, you're listening again, you're editing. But but that might take you from, instead of 8 hours, it might take you down to 2 hours. That's a really good saving of time. So, I strongly encourage the use of, first of all, recording first, and then secondly, using AI in conjunction with the recording to be able to do your transcription. But remember the personal element, you still have to contribute to that.